Welcome to this video on building your field labor budget as part of your snow and ice budget. Here we're going to go through some really important concepts. So if you haven't watched this video or you're thinking about skipping over this video, please don't. Give it a watch. Probably the most important concepts when it comes to building your snow and ice budget are going to be covered here. And that's how to split labor from field versus overhead. We'll get to that in just a second. Before we dive in too deep, let's look at what you should have prepared before you start your budget. Ideally, you want to get with your payroll person and see if you can figure out how many hours on average your staff work for your snow and ice season. And even better, if you can get that broken down by employee type, that'll really help you dial in the right amount of labor for your budget. You're probably going to find that snowplow operators work more hours than shovelers, for example, and knowing what the average plow operator and the average shoveler works in a season is really good information. You also want to look at your payroll summary for things like how many overtime hours did you pay out because of snow? And if you can, grab it for the last 3 to 5 years so that you can really see in given numbers of different changing events, heavy snows and light snows, how many hours you work in each different kind of event. Ideally, what you want to come up here is an average amount of hours each employee needs to work for a snow season. What's also important here is that you do try to split out your snow hours from your maintenance or construction hours or any other division you're working. This can get confusing in months like November and in March, where you might start late or start early, and you could have staff doing work in both divisions almost at the same time. So just do your best at the beginning and the end of the snow season to try to pull out, if possible, just the snow hours, so that you know your snow budget's got just the snow revenue and your labor budget's got just the hours or cost of wages required to generate that revenue. Now, one of the biggest questions, or problems, or causes of mistakes when building a snow budget is the separation of what goes in the field labor budget and what goes in overhead. Now, it's impossible for us to say these people are overhead and these people are in your field labor budget, because companies don't all estimate the same way. But we can give you a hard and fast rule you can use to figure out where your people belong. Here's the rule. People whose time and cost of wages you include when you price or estimate a job, they belong in the field labor budget. People whose time and cost of wages you don't include when you estimate a job go in the overhead budget. When you're estimating or putting together the price for a job, and you're trying to calculate the price by going, I need somebody for so many hours at these wage costs, you're recovering the cost of the wage in the estimate itself. Now, there's other people, for example, like admin staff, who when you're coming up with your cost for your estimate, you're not thinking about admin staff or sales staff, and you're probably not thinking about your mechanic in the garage. Those people need to get recovered as an overhead cost, because they're not in the estimate. And that's why the rule works that way. People whose time and costs you estimate go in field labor because you're recovering those time and costs when you build the estimate. Anyone whose time and costs you don't factor when you're estimating, they have to go in overhead or else they'll get missed. Now, this is really, really important when you're looking at people like Ice Patrol or you're looking at quality control supervisors in your snow and ice season. If you do nightly ice patrol, or at every event you send out supervisors to drive around and check out on sites, sometimes they could be field labor, or sometimes they could be overhead, depending on the company that you are and how you estimate. Now, most companies don't estimate 100 visits of ice patrol in a winter at 5 or 10 minutes a visit. And if that's the case for you, you need to make sure that whoever's doing your ice patrol is in your overhead budget, because you're not actually estimating 100 visits at 10 minutes a time or whatever you want to estimate. Now, on the other hand, some companies do take that ice patrol person and build them into their estimates. And if that's the case, that ice patrol person goes in your field labor budget because you are recovering their time and the cost of their wages when you factor in those 100 visits in your estimates. Same with your supervisor who's driving around the field. Lots of times those staff end up in your field labor budget because they are out in the field and not necessarily in the office. But that doesn't mean they're in the right spot. The only way you can make sure that they're in the right spot is by asking yourself whether they get estimated or not. If you build into your jobs supervision time or quality control time at an amount of hours and a cost of wages for that quality control supervisor, then that person is field labor because your estimates are recovering their costs. But if when you build an estimate, you don't think about the cost, not directly anyway, of quality control and supervision, then those people go in your overhead budgets. And just like admins and mechanics and payroll and maybe the owner, the cost of those wages are going to be part of your overhead markup because they are not being calculated in each individual estimate. Now, if you stay true to that rule, people whose time and costs you estimate go in your field labor budget and everybody else goes in overhead, then you won't be steered wrong. And you'll end up with a budget that gives you good pricing on your estimates and a very accurate overhead that you need to recover. So here's what a completed field labor budget might look like for snow. We'll take you through each section. Up at the top here is your labor burden. This 20% says that 20% of every dollar I spend in direct payroll wages needs to go cover workers' comp, unemployment insurance, and other payroll taxes. Now that's pretty normal for companies, but you might be at 13 or 12%, and you might be at 25 or 27%, and it all depends on what state you're in and what your rates are at. So that could be higher or lower than the 20, but that's a good estimate. It should be in and around that range. Your overtime multiplier just says 1.5x because it's 1.5 times, meaning if we pay overtime, we pay time and a half. Now down here, we've got the staff. And remember again, we're only in this budget going to include the staff whose time we estimate. So I've got my main ones right here. I've got equipment operators. I've got 3 of those, and I'm going to estimate they work about 300 hours in the winter season. Now, because we're building a snow budget, we want to make sure that we don't recover all the hours of each person, just the hours they work in snow. So my equipment operators, 3 at 300 means each equipment operator, I'm going to expect they work about a total of 300 payroll hours in the snow and ice season. Then I've got my plow drivers in there, and I'm going to say I've got 5 of those. Each plow driver works an average of 220 hours a year at an average wage of $20 an hour, and I'll get a total budget wages over there as well. Now, it's important to notice here, I'm not breaking it down by person's name. I'm just doing it by role for 2 reasons. 1, it makes my budget way simpler, and 2, each role gets roughly paid the same. Even if there's small differences, the average wage should handle what the average person in that role makes per hour. It makes your budget a lot cleaner and simpler. So when I'm done this, I'm sort of covered for most companies who my billable or estimated labor people are. It's my operators, my plow drivers, and my shovelers. Now, if you have anybody else like salt truck drivers, or you can get more complicated than this for sure, you can build yours in the same way. Just your number of staff at that position, your average hours per staff at that position. So this 100 hours here means 100 hours per shoveler. Then I've got my average wage. That's the average hourly wage they make at that position. And then Element will calculate your total for you. If you pay overtime in snow, so let's say, for example, I'm going to guesstimate that each snow shoveler would work 15 hours of overtime in addition to the 100 regular hours, then I'll put 15 here, and notice that's recalculated itself. Set that back to 0, and it'll subtract that. So that's how I'd build in overtime. Now let's take a look at an example like that ice patrol person who may or may not get estimated. If you don't include time like ice patrol or supervision time in your estimates, then what I've done here in the video is probably sufficient in terms of your snow labor budget. These people are the roles whose hours get estimated when we price a job. If you do, when you're building a bid, count ice patrol, as in say, I got 100 visits at 10 minutes a visit of ice patrol, I'm going to put that right in my bid, then you need to recover that ice patrol's person here in your labor budget. So if I was to build another person in my budget, I could hit new. I could say ice patroller. I'm going to say I've got 2 of those on staff. They work an average of 300 hours in the winter, a year each, or whatever your average is. You'd put it in there. Overtime hours, if applicable, I'll put in here as well. And then average wage. So whatever I pay them by the hour on average would go in here. Now I've factored for my ice patroller's wage here and not in overhead. And that just means I have to make sure I estimate that ice patroller when I'm building my estimates because they're here and not part of my overhead. Now, if your ice patroller or supervisor's on salary, it's the same thing. Just use the salary field staff tab up here. So this time I deleted the ice patrol. I'll just do a quick example of a supervisor, a quality control supervisor. I'll go over here to my salary field staff, and then I'm going to go new. And let's say we're going to have this person as our ops manager, and I'll put in brackets quality control. Now I've got one staff. My annual hours, again, are going to be how many hours just for this snow season are we going to put in here? So if I'm going to estimate that I'm going to pay them, say, 400 hours for the snow season, and if their salary for the snow season is $12,000 for the 4 months, then I've done everything correctly that I need to do here. And we're going to recover that salary in this example. When we estimate, we're going to have to make sure we estimate quality control time in our bids because that person's time is not part of overhead, it's here. If your quality control is not part of your estimates and is part of, say, overhead, then we just take this person out of our budget. But when I do my overhead budget, I'm going to have to make sure my quality control person is in overhead. It's not like we're skipping them or missing them. It's a choice. They're either part of overhead or they're part of your estimate. And depending on whether you estimate them or not, that'll dictate what budget they belong in. The field labor budget can seem complicated, but it's really quite simple once you get used to that rule. Anyone whose time and hours get calculated when you're building an estimate, they go in the field labor budget. Anyone whose time and hours get ignored when you're estimating, they go in the overhead budget. And if you stick with that, it'll never steer you wrong. You'll get better, more accurate pricing on your estimates, and you'll get a very realistic and very proper overhead recovery factor for your snow and ice. That said, if you have any questions about that rule or anything else, be sure to email us at support@golmn.com. Thanks for watching and join us in our next video, which is budgeting for your snow and ice equipment.